This is the true story of a woman my age abused as a child. All the words I use are her words. The interviews you will see with professionals who work to protect children are conducted by her. This second programme looks at her life from age 11 to age 18. When I moved to secondary school, things deteriorated even more in my life. There was a lot of violence, and one time my mum found cigarettes in my room and beat me black and blue.
When I heard your story, I felt so sad and so sorry that it had happened to you, and that from a baby right through primary school and right through secondary school you'd felt that you'd had nobody that you could go and talk to, and your problems had escalated, and for you there was nowhere to turn, and eventually you ran away. That shouldn't happen now. We've got systems in place where we've got agencies that talk to each other, agencies that share information, and staff that are trained to support young people like you.
Well, what the NSPCC is working to is to ensure that everybody is aware that it is everyone's responsibility to take action if there are concerns about abuse. What is more recent in terms of developments is the awareness that it's important for everybody within the school community to be trained in supporting children where there are concerns or there may be concerns about abuse. So, for example, the NSPCC have recently produced a tool for child protection officers to train the entire school community on recognising signs of child abuse, so that everybody could take notice and take action if there are concerns about a child. So, for example, it wouldn't just be up to a teacher to pick up any signs and concerns. It could be a mealtime supervisor. It could be a learning support assistant. So it's important that everybody does communicate with each other and not actually leave a concern for somebody else to pick up on.
As I got older, I seemed to do more and more wrong. I suppose I was growing up and getting louder, and that seemed to antagonise my mum. And it got to the point where she'd hit me with anything she could lay her hands on. But no one seemed to take up my case with social services.
One of the issues that we've had is teachers or head teachers really worried and concerned about what a referral to social services will do to the relationship between themselves and the parent. And we'll say things like they've worked so, or the teachers or the head teacher has worked so incredibly hard to build a relationship with the parent that they'd hate to see that destroyed or undermined. And the one thing I would like to say to teachers is, if that is your concern, is to pick up the phone and speak to a social worker or to a team manager and say that without giving the child's name, can they just talk about the situation? And it might be that the situation is such that we can agree something along the lines of, well, there are a number of agencies out there that can help without coming to us. Why don't you try them first? Why don't you try Family Steps? Things that they can access without coming to us. But I think if head teachers and teachers handle it sensitively, explain to them the CAF procedure, that group doesn't meet, aren't about children who meet social services thresholds. They're for children who the school are picking up issues, but if they intervene quickly enough, those issues will be able to be managed and contained, that the parents will be less frightened about speaking about all the things that are impacting on that child, especially if they know that even though social services is sitting there, we're sitting there in a consultative capacity. We're sitting there because not everybody sitting around that table knows everything. So we can contribute something to that child's plan that maybe another organisation can't.
Eventually, my secondary school teachers got in touch with social services, and after a lengthy process, they took us into foster care. By the time I was 13, they decided that my mum had changed enough for us to go back home. She hadn't. She got back into her old ways and started beating me up again.
Well, whilst you were in foster care, you should have had regular reviews. You should have been met with your social worker. She should have asked you, or he should have asked you, how the foster placement was going, whether you were happy, what you wanted for the future. These are statutory requirements under legislation that's been passed by the government to ensure that children in foster care, their views are taken into consideration and what's also in their best interest for the future. And there should have been regular contact with your social worker and with your mother to see what was going on at home and whether it was at all possible for you to return to her care. And if it wasn't possible, then that should have been explained to you. But you should have also had home visits at weekends to your mum. That should have been seen how that was going, as well as regular contact with her, which should have been subject to supervision by social workers to ensure that as to whether there was going to be a possibility for you to return to her care.
Those things didn't happen for me, and continual beatings from my mum led me to start running away from home, and social services sent me to live with my biological dad in another part of the country. He didn't know how to react, and he didn't know how to be a dad.
You don't just package a child up and send her off to another part of the country where she's never lived before, to live with somebody that she possibly hasn't seen for many, many years. It has to be a gradual, planned introduction, and that also has to be supervised by social workers who should be checking to see whether the placement's appropriate, how it's going, and whether it's working out.
We need to do our job thoroughly in the forefront, robustly in the forefront, to make sure that we're satisfied enough that the child is not endangered. But that job doesn't stop there. Once we've done all that forefront work, we need to make a decision as to whether or not that person can meet a child's needs. So we'd have to carry on assessing things like liaising with the school, liaising with the dad. What are you finding difficult? What parts of the days are you finding difficult? Liaising with the child, how does it feel? Have you been able to make friends? How are your dad getting on? Is he around when you need him? What times do you need him? So that we can bridge that relationship.
When I moved to my dad's in another part of the country, if I'd had a bit more support, things might have been different. As it was, I was so unhappy, I resorted to living on the streets.
This is a perfect Victoria Climbié example, isn't it? Where agencies didn't communicate, there wasn't the facility to tie up information so that wherever this child was or whichever hospital she walked in, there was an opportunity to see that there was a history following this child, there were concerns following this child. One of the things that's been developed now is Contact Point, and Contact Point is a computer system that will provide every child in the United Kingdom's name will go on that system, and a whole lot of agencies will feed into that system. So, for example, as soon as that child's name comes onto our database, that information will feed through to Contact Point. Contact Point will compare the information we have on that child to other agencies. There would be passwords to log on, and we'll be able to see, social services had a history with this family, or there's a current practitioner from this and this place who was involved with this child. Well, let's find out who it is. Now, the exact details won't be on there because of confidentiality issues, but then that practitioner can then phone Contact Point and say, this is my security clearance, I need to know more information about who's involved and why, who do I contact, and then they can be cleared for more information.
Through Every Child Matters and with the Victoria Climbié case, schools and agencies are talking to each other more. We would hope to share information with different schools, so we'd make sure that you were hopefully undertaking the same syllabuses within your GCSE subjects. Now with the new Key Stage 3 curriculum coming along, it gives us a lot more opportunity, a lot more scope to work with what we call personalised learning. So we'd look at your individual needs, and then schools would share that information with other schools. So we try and address the needs that you need for you to develop as an individual.
I never properly went to school from the age of 14. I'd go whenever I could, but when you're being hunted by the police, school isn't really an option. And whenever I talked to the police, it was in front of my dad, even though we weren't getting on.
Things have changed beyond all recognition, I think, from the your experience a number of years ago. Certainly the police and social services and the other agencies have worked really hard to get this right, because it is recognised in the past we didn't get it right. Now we never speak to a child if the person that they're making the allegation against is there, or even it might be that we're not too sure. If we're not sure who's the allegation is against, then we will always endeavour to speak to the child on their own. You know, our big working statement is that the welfare of the child is paramount, and that is what all the agencies do now to try and make sure. And part of our working practices is that we do a joint visit with social services all the time. In the past, social services would quite often go out on their own and speak to a child, and then that would make our investigations very difficult. And they would come back really and tell the police, yeah, there's a crime for you to investigate, and this is what we found out for you, which made it very difficult. But we've turned that on its head, and in some instances we even go out before social services if we think that we're losing evidence, and we can get in there and make things better a lot quicker. And the other side is as well, really, that when we're speaking to children, it might be that they don't always tell us the first time, but that doesn't mean that we go away and give them, you know, an impression that we don't believe you. We work very hard to make children understand that we believe what they're saying, and if they've not had that opportunity or they don't feel comfortable in the first instance, we may go back and speak to them on another day. There's a lot of work that does go on, so if we don't even just go down the criminal route, the police will still investigate. They will still input into social services about what we think's going on, what we think, you know, should be done to improve the life of that child. So big change around now as compared to how it was a number of years ago.
Looking back at my childhood, if agencies had shared the information they had, things might have been different for me. Things with my mum might have been resolved, and she might have received the help that she needed to be able to support us. There was no justification for what she did, but she is my mum, and I still love her.
When I heard your story, I was very touched, I was moved, I was angry, because it shouldn't have been like that for you. But I admired you, because what you've done with your life is fantastic. You tried to understand your mum, and you still love her, and you've used that experience to help other people, and I think that's fantastic.
Unfortunately, I think your story could happen again today. Whilst there are procedures in place, they're not always followed. Things aren't always picked up, and children, we know, are not listened to as they should be. And I think we know, and not that I think, I know there are children out there who are in abusive homes where it's not being investigated, where it's not being picked up. And that's not necessarily the fault of teachers, but what we do know is that there are social workers and local authorities that are hard stretched, who do not have sufficient staff, where they have staff leaving, and where referrals aren't made. And so I think we can't be complacent about this. There are no guarantees. The most important thing is to be watchful, be careful, and have the interests of children as your first priority as a teacher, and not to sit on information, but to pass it on.